All right, so I have 10 o'clock. I think now might be a good time to start transitioning into today's session. So welcome back. I know this is the third of 4 sessions. I'm very excited when I found out who is going to be leading the 4th session. I've worked with her over several semesters now, and she's amazing. You're going to love working with Frances. So I'm very excited for that. I will probably even come to that because I always learn new things when I go into her class. Her students are always very attentive and respectful and engaged, and I always feel like that's partially a reflection of the instructor, and so she's very strong teaching faculty here, and I'm very excited that you get to spend some time with her at the next session. So I strongly encourage you to make some efforts to make it to that one. Anyone else dealing with hay fever right now? Right? Just a couple of people? Yeah, I think I slept the entire weekend. It was amazing. But all that aside, I do want to just add a quick note as we're starting off here. And this really comes down to a Stephen King quote that I think about pretty frequently when it comes down to skill development and things like that. And at one point, he said, you know, if you want to be a good writer, you must do 2 things above all others: read a lot and write a lot. And I think the same is true for presenting. I think if you want to become a better presenter over time, you need to do 2 things in particular. You need to watch a lot of other people present, especially a lot of people who are very different from you, and you need to take every opportunity that you can to present as well, even if it's in a small situation like a team meeting where you already feel comfortable with the audience, up to larger scale events that give you a chance to practice, refine, and hone your skills over time. So with that in mind, I'm trying to give you an opportunity to see a lot of different people present today. I have quite a few clips that support this presentation so that you can see what some of these techniques look like live and in action. So I just want to forewarn you that there are quite a few video clips here today, but they're meant to be illustrative in purposes, even the clip from the office that we'll look at in just a couple of minutes. In terms of presenting and starting off a presentation, that beginning can be really challenging for a lot of people. That first 2 minutes is probably the most stressful part of the entire thing. Has anyone else noticed that? Yeah, that tends to be when the nerves are most heightened and starting is very difficult. I know we had talked a little bit about establishing credibility with your audience, but that can be really important at the very beginning of the presentation. Not only that, but maintaining that credibility as you move throughout your presentation. So there are a couple of things that you can do right off the bat when you're feeling really nervous that you can kind of pre-package in, and these are things that help you get through that first 2 minutes or so. The first would be starting on time. And I know when I'm talking to like student life professionals as an example, this is not a hard sell in terms of advice, right? But starting on time is really an effective strategy in the sense that it's not about you saying, oh, my time is so important as the presenter. It's about me saying, I recognize that your time is important and you were here, and I want to honor and respect that. And if other people come in a little bit later, I'm very glad that they're here. Do you know what I mean? That just happens. Thank you. We timed that out perfectly. Yeah. I'll slip you the $10 later. Some other things that can cost you a little bit of credibility at the beginning of a presentation that I would encourage you to avoid doing. Starting with an apology. Have you ever seen those sessions where people come in, they're like, sorry, I'm really sick, or like, I just had to finish this up last night, and this didn't work, and like, I'm just really struggling with this. On one hand, it feels kind of human. On the other, the audience was probably never going to notice until you said something. Right? So I try to avoid starting with an apology. Usually it makes you look a little unprepared too, right? Like, oh, I just finished this last night because my computer died and all these other things. I'm like, oh, I get like the half-baked presentation that you just put in the oven last night. I got you. This is great. And it also starts by diminishing the quality of your presentation before you've even really gotten into it. So it's just one of those areas where you end up sacrificing a bit of credibility when you don't have to. Another thing that really helps in that first 2 minutes would be knowing your technology, and there are a couple of different things that can help out here. First, silencing any app notifications. I've been in a lot of presentations where people keep getting Outlook email that is popping up in the right-hand corner, just on the bottom there, and you know, you're seeing like all their listserv notifications and emails from people in the department. My favorite presentation scenario where I accidentally caused that was I think it was Tony Rose, who I had worked with in technology, to take a look at some of the slides and give him some pointers and things like that. And he was doing a presentation for all of technology. And I could tell that he had applied some of the strategies that we talked to. So I just shot him a quick email real quick that said, Tony, love the new slides. I can tell that you're really taking some of this to heart. And 5 seconds later, bling, and it pops up in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen while he's trying to present. So finding a way to silence those app notifications, which you can learn to do with just a simple Google search. If you have a Mac, it's pretty easy. You just click in the notification bar in the top right corner, scroll up, and there's a Do Not Disturb function, just like on your iPhone. So there are a couple of different options there. I would say try and be set up well in advance. If something goes wrong with the technology, just roll with it. It happens from time to time. 10 minutes before we started, we found out that the sound would not come out of one of the ports over here. We had to switch to another one, just kind of ran with it instead of letting it stress me out, because there's usually a backup plan there. And this is really the important thing, because sometimes people are bouncing between multiple presentations, especially when there are multiple presenters. Please take some time to clean up your desktop before you get up there. If someone's going to see your desktop at some point, and your wallpaper is maybe like a picture of your family, that's one thing, right? But when it looks like this does not look like an organized presenter. Do you know what I mean? The simplest way around this, truthfully, is to make a folder, call it like important documents or something like that, and move everything into that folder temporarily. So that way you only have one thing on your desktop and people are like, wow, that's amazing. As someone who extends their desktop, usually you don't see anything on mine, right? But even if you looked at my actual desktop, there are only like 4 or 5 folders on there. So just one of those things to try and make it look clean, so that when people are seeing you set up and things like that, it makes you look a little bit more organized as a person. Another thing that's really helpful is to structure your content. We talked about this in the last session when we were talking about organizing content, making sure that it's put together in a meaningful way, storytelling devices and things like that. But it's just a way of forecast to the audience what's going to happen, and most presenters do this already. Since you already have a clearly defined structure for your presentation, just giving them a little bit of a roadmap for what's going to happen, establishing expectations with them, is also a really nice starting point for those first 2 minutes. Now, since that's going to be the time that you are most nervous, this is when filler language tends to be at its most extreme. I don't know how many of you feel like you have fallen victim to this in the past, right? Where the filler languages, it just comes in, it takes over. And I want to point out that unless it's very extreme and noticeable, it's probably okay. And what I mean by that is filler language is actually very common in conversation. Everybody had their go-to things. Even if we were compared to very different presidents, like Reagan had that, that was his go-to filler phrase. Obama's was probably, let me be clear, right? Everybody has their own things. And filler language is actually so important that there are signs for it in American Sign Language. There are signs for filler language because it communicates to people, I'm still in the middle of a thought, I'm not quite done with it yet, I just need a quick pause in the middle of this sentence. But again, when it's too frequent, that's when it becomes a bit problematic. Now, if you find that this is something that's affecting you, I would encourage you to basically play a game of Clue with what your filler language is. And what I mean by that is to figure out what are your filler words, when do you tend to use them, and why do you tend to use them. This is just a quick little diagnostic for you. So there are a couple of things that you can do to help out with that whole, what are my filler words, when do I tend to use them, why do I tend to use them. The first is really simple. You can just record yourself. And this is as easy as just using the audio recording app on your phone. And there are actually little lapel mics that you can buy for maybe like $5 off of Amazon if you want slightly better audio that's right up here instead of just putting your phone nearby. But we also have microphones and things in media services, so if you want to record yourself for a presentation and then listen back to it later, once you get past that, I really hate the sound of my voice on audio recording phase. It becomes really instructive and enlightening to figure out, oh, this is when I tend to use most of my filler language, when I'm going faster, or hey, I was running low on time and then it started to happen a lot, or someone asked me a question at a time I wasn't expecting a question, and just different things like that. You can also rely on friends and family, colleagues. They probably have a pretty good idea of when you use your filler language and why. My filler language, and I don't want to shatter the glass for you because now you're not going to hear anything but it, but my filler language tends to be the question, right? I work it in a lot, and now you're going to hear it constantly. So I'm going to have to be extra cognizant of the fact that I use that word. But this is just another area of diagnostic help to figure out when does this happen, why does it happen, and not only that, but where does it come from? For most people, filler language tends to come from one of two places. Either you're feeling underprepared for the presentation, which sometimes happens. Has anyone been forced into a presentation on very short notice? Has that happened before? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of head nods, a couple of hands. It happens, and when you go into a situation feeling underprepared, you're going to feel nervous as a result, right? And basically feeling nervous and anxious in general, because a lot of people do carry some level of anxiety around the concept of speaking in public, even when it's around familiar audiences or audiences that are inherently going to be friendly to you, right? So what I want to focus on today would be, how do we help boost your preparation for your presentations, and how do we help reduce some of that anxiety? And I want to point out that I literally did the math. Based off of the average human lifespan, the amount of time that we're spending together today, this is how much of your life you are sharing with me this morning. It's not very much. And so while I can present some strategies to you, it's up to you to take these and then actually apply them in your day-to-day life and within future presentation situations. And I am going to play a clip from The Office, but I think it's a great example of what it's typically like as you're trying to apply some of these things over time.
All right, guys. Well, see you later, warehouse. Catch you on the flippity flap. All right, then. See you guys. Catch you later, warehouse. See you on the flippity flap. Catch you on the flippity flap. Catch you guys on the flippity flip. Catch you guys. Catch you guys on the flippity flip. Flippity flip. Flippity flip. Really? Okay. See you guys.
Does anyone else feel like he was genuinely happy when he made it? Like even outside of the character? Right, but it's just that thing that I was talking about with the presentation design, that if it's a skill, it takes a lot of time and practice and failure and struggle and reflection to actually get better and better at that thing. You can't just go into it once and expect success. It's usually not going to happen that way, which is really unfortunate. So in terms of helping you feel a bit more prepared and reducing anxiety, I want to give you a couple of strategies that help fit with different stages of a presentation. And usually these are the 4 stages of a presentation. This is how I'm going to structure the rest of today's session. Again, there will be video clips throughout to illustrate some of the concepts that we're talking about. But there is the preparation stage. That's usually where we spend the vast majority of our time. If any of you have ever done a training session as an example, you know that you personally spent way many more hours preparing to deliver that training than you actually did delivering that training, right? And so since this is where the bulk of our time is going to go, this is where we're going to spend some time figuring out what can we do to make sure that we're prepared. How do you start off a presentation in a way that's engaging and interesting for an audience? What are some strategies for engaging them throughout? And how do we close out strong so that people remember what we're talking about? It's basically how we're going to structure this. Now, in terms of the preparation phase, there are usually 2 different areas where you're going to be preparing. The first is really preparing yourself. Like, how are we going to prepare ourselves for this? A lot of people don't know this, but I actually played drums in high school. And I spent a lot of time with it. And then it started to get more and more difficult. I wasn't in a band or anything. This was just something that I was learning personally, so I was going to lessons. And at some point, it kind of plateaued in terms of my progression, and then it actually regressed a little bit, and I ended up giving up and not going back to it. And what high school me didn't get is, again, I know I showed you this for the presentation design, but it was a skill, and I wasn't willing to do this part. I wasn't willing to struggle with it and overcome. Right? That is a really difficult part. Now, most people walk into presentation situations, and by the way, this used to be the #1 fear of Americans, public speaking. That has been supplanted by other things in the past 3 years, believe it or not. And actually, I'm just going to leave that comment there. We won't go any further into it. But a lot of people walk into presentation situations with an element of dread and worry, and they're not necessarily looking forward to it. And it actually makes sense, because presenting is scary. It really is. It can be scary, and if you want to understand why presenting can be scary, it comes down to literally tens of thousands of years of an evolutionary response called fight or flight or freeze, right? You've probably heard it called fight or flight. Freeze is also an option, which is why sometimes people don't do anything in a situation that's really stressful. But in terms of that fight or flight response, if you think about this as an evolutionary response to stressful situations, what I would encourage you to think about is, like, right now, since we are all classified as the same type of mammal, I am the mammal in our herd of humans here that is most at risk. The reason being that I am standing up, I have made myself more noticeable than anyone else in the group, which means that I have made myself more vulnerable. Like if anyone's gonna get eaten by a tiger right now, it is me, okay? I have made myself vulnerable up here. I'm also very exposed. So it makes a lot of sense that this would be a stressful situation for me rather than being able to sit down and blend in a bit. One thing that can be really helpful here is to recognize that stress is not necessarily a bad thing in a presentation situation. I would encourage you to think about how could we reframe that stress and fear as something that's actually a positive. Remember how we were talking about framing as a storytelling device? Sometimes we can use that as a strategy for personal development as well. So I have a really short clip for you from a lady named Dr. Kelly McGonigal. She did some work into how stress affects the body and also how it affects the mind. And I think she makes a really compelling argument based off of her research on how we can reframe stress to be a good thing to help ourselves, especially in a presentation type of situation.
When you change your mind about stress, you can change your body's response to stress. Now, to explain how this works, I want you all to pretend that you are participants in a study designed to stress you out. It's called the social stress test. You come into the laboratory and you're told you have to give a 5-minute impromptu speech on your personal weaknesses to a panel of expert evaluators sitting right in front of you. And to make sure you feel the pressure, there are bright lights and a camera in your face, kind of like this. And the evaluators have been trained to give you discouraging nonverbal feedback, like this. Now that you're sufficiently demoralized, time for part 2, a math test. And unbeknownst to you, the experimenter has been trained to harass you during it. Now, we're gonna all do this together. It's gonna be fun, for me. Okay. I want you all to count backwards from 996 in increments of 7. You're gonna do this out loud as fast as you can, starting with 996. Go. Go faster. Faster, please. You're going too slow. Stop, 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 stop. That guy made a mistake. We're gonna have to start all over again. You're not very good at this, are you? Okay, so you get the idea. Now, if you were actually in this study, you'd probably be a little stressed out. Your heart might be pounding, you might be breathing faster, maybe breaking out into a sweat. And normally we interpret these physical changes as anxiety or signs that we aren't coping very well with the pressure. But what if you viewed them instead as signs that your body was energized, was preparing you to meet this challenge? Now that is exactly what participants were told in a study conducted at Harvard University. Before they went through the social stress test, they were taught to rethink their stress response as helpful. That pounding heart is preparing you for action. If you're breathing faster, it's no problem. It's getting more oxygen to your brain. And participants who learned to view the stress response as helpful for their performance, well, they were less stressed out, less anxious, more confident. But the most fascinating finding to me was how their physical stress response changed. Now, in a typical stress response, your heart rate goes up and your blood vessels constrict like this. And this is one of the reasons that chronic stress is sometimes associated with cardiovascular disease. It's not really healthy to be in this state all the time. But in the study, when participants viewed their stress response as helpful, their blood vessels stayed relaxed like this. Their heart was still pounding, but this is a much healthier cardiovascular profile. It actually looks a lot like what happens in moments of joy and courage. Over a lifetime of stressful experiences, this one biological change could be the difference between a stress-induced heart attack at age 50 and living well into your 90s. And this is really what the new science of stress reveals, that how you think about stress matters. So my goal as a health psychologist has changed. I no longer want to get rid of your stress. I want to make you better at stress.
I recognize that was not the most. I was not very generous with that end freeze frame. I don't have a ton of control over where the clip ends, so my apologies to Dr. Kelly McGonigal. But I found this to be a really illustrative TED Talk. I would encourage you to track down the whole thing and watch it at some point. But that idea of reframing what your stress and fear is, I'll actually put it up a little bit later, and I can send a list of what these were if that would be helpful. That concept of reframing what stress is actually doing for your body instead of to your body can be a really helpful shift in mindset. Again, I know we talked about that first 2 minutes being the most stressful, but some people feel the entire thing is stressful because of the fear that they happen to associate with it. So if you can learn to challenge those responses, challenge those automatic negative thoughts that say like, hey, maybe this isn't going to go well, and rethink it as, you know, the reason I am breathing harder right now is because my brain needs more oxygen so that I can do this at a really high level, right? That is a different approach that actually changes how you respond to that situation. So while it can be really stressful, it's something that's preparing you to do good things. That's some of my thoughts on how you might prepare yourself for the audience. And it's usually just coming down to reframing your stress and anxiety as something that's actually helping you out. The other area of preparation would be preparing for the audience. And thankfully, we've already done a lot of the heavy lifting here. In the presentation design session, remember when we talked about the golden circle and trying to find opportunities to focus on the audience's why? That key question is going to lead you into a lot of really great situations with the audience, especially when you've nailed it. And what I mean by this is an audience is always looking for a reason to care about something. Sometimes that interest is, you know, constructively selfish, and what I mean by that is, you know, if you sign up for a training event through leadership and professional development, it's probably because A, you want free lunch, but B, you want to develop whatever that skill is. Right? There was a really great one on negotiating strategies a couple weeks ago. I know that there are some on folks who are caretakers, and there are all sorts of different things. So it's constructively selfish to go like, I want some personal development in this area, I'm going to go do that thing. Sometimes it's just that they don't necessarily realize what the why is, or that something has a really big impact in their day-to-day lives, and this is important. So focusing on that why is a really nice area of reassurance for you that you're going to talk about something that the audience has to care about. Because again, most people focus on the what or the how. Now, I don't offer a lot of confidence building strategies for a couple of different reasons. One is it would be a little disingenuous for me because presenting usually gives like more energy than it takes because I've been doing it for a while. That's also the other situation is I work with folks who haven't had as much presentation experience, and I have lost sight of what that is like as someone who's been doing it for longer, right? I officially have, it's something called expert bias, which actually plagues faculty pretty frequently. It's harder for them to understand what it's like for a student to be learning something for the first time because they've been doing it for so long. Not only that, but I feel like if we did a brainstorming session right now on what are some good ways to build confidence in our presentation, we would come up with all of the same responses, right? This would not be a very hard exercise. There's a lot of the same core advice out there. I don't always agree with all of it, but I'm not so interested in those things. I'm more so interested in how do we think about how we present and how do we think about how we approach different situations, because my argument has always been that when you change your thinking about a situation, you tend to change your behavior as a result of that. So we're going to focus more on how do we think about things like stress going into a presentation. So when it comes to preparing yourself, again, if we want to diminish the idea of what these filler words are, especially if they're problematic, it usually comes down to spending some time talking to other people, recording ourselves, trying to figure out what are our filler words, when do we tend to use them, why do we tend to use them, and then doing our best to diminish those circumstances. Once you're even aware of what might trigger it, it's easier to create situations for yourself that let you avoid those circumstances. It usually does come down to, I'm feeling really stressed out and anxious about this thing, but preparing yourself by A, reframing how you think about your stress response, and making sure that you've taken every opportunity possible to emphasize the why for your audience and why they should care about something, tends to help alleviate a lot of that stress going into the situation because you know that you're prepared and you know that your body is doing something to help you out. So that's the preparation stage. Let's say you've done all that. If you take all the lessons from the presentation design session, the graphic design session, you're rethinking about why you're nervous, right? And it's actually a good thing. Your body's getting ready for a big presentation. It's getting you prepared for this. Now we have to start this presentation. And in terms of specific strategies to start a presentation, I've always been a fan of something called the punch model. And this is what the punch model breaks down to. So these are things like personal, unexpected, novel, challenging, and humorous. Remember when we talked about storytelling techniques like framing and contrast, and it turns out that even though those are individual techniques, they work really well together. And then when we talked about contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity, those were each individual graphic design techniques, but they worked really well together. Same goes for the things in the punch model. A lot of really great beginnings often incorporate two or more of these things into one another. And I'll break down each one just to give you an idea of what they would look like, but the punch model is a nice, I would say, a well to pull from if you're looking for a good way to start off a presentation. So in terms of personal, it would be a personal anecdote or story from you that you feel is comfortable for you to share and also appropriate for you to share. And what I mean by that is if you want to talk about an experience that you had with a family member or something like that that was constructive and appropriate, that's all well and good. I would encourage you to be very cognizant of where the line is so that you don't risk oversharing with someone else, right? Has anyone been in a situation like, I've been in 2 or 3 of them where the presenter came out and they overshared, and I think they immediately realized they shared too much about their personal life, right? On one hand, it's a fine line because you want to connect with the audience. You want them to know that you are also a human being with human emotions and human experiences. At the same time, you don't want them to be thinking about like, oh gosh, I can't believe that they shared that the entire time. You know what I mean? So it's a little bit of a fine line. Personal anecdotes can be really effective though. If you're looking for like a nice safe spot to start with, stories about pets are almost always universally good, okay? So that's like a good starting point. Unexpected. Unexpected is really about breaking presentation norms. There are a lot of things that are typically expected in presentation situations that are considered to be classical bits of advice and things like that. Subverting those expectations can be unexpected, but really constructive for the audience, depending on how it's done. So I'm actually going to go back to Dr. Kelly McGonigal, and I'm going to show you how she started off her TED Talk. If you happen to miss the title earlier, it'll be up on the screen again. But what I appreciate is, again, going into a presentation, I literally just talked about how we want to establish credibility and maintain that credibility, and she does something that would almost seem to give up the credibility, but it actually gives her more. And it's basically her being vulnerable and saying, I've been doing one thing, but I think as a professional, I was completely wrong. And her saying that actually led to a lot of intrigue, a lot of curiosity, and not only that, a lot of respect for someone who can come out and say like, I think I did the wrong thing, and here's what I think the right thing is.
I have a confession to make. But first, I want you to make a little confession to me. In the past year, I want you to just raise your hand if you've experienced relatively little stress. Anyone? Mm-hmm. How about a moderate amount of stress? Who's experienced a lot of stress? Yeah, me too. But that is not my confession. My confession is this: I'm a health psychologist, and my mission is to help people be happier and healthier. But I fear that something I've been teaching for the last 10 years is doing more harm than good, and it has to do with stress.
Okay. So again, there's a lot of subversion of expectations here in the sense that she comes out, she's like, I have to make a confession, right? And then you're immediately intrigued. You're like, what's the confession? What is this? But then she tells the audience, I need you to make a confession first, right? She's encouraging them to be vulnerable. And not only that, she admits that as a professional, she was wrong about something, which I think that level of vulnerability, it's kind of like the Brene Brown effect. Like, it actually gave her even more credibility to speak on the subject, which you would not traditionally expect. It almost feels like a sacrifice of credibility as someone who's supposed to be an expert in the field. So to me, it was unexpected. It hooked me right away. That was only 48 seconds, but I was immediately interested enough to watch that same TED Talk, and it turned out the whole thing was really great. But that intro was very good because to me, it was very unexpected and broke a lot of presentation norms. All right, the N in the punch model is novel and not this kind. Okay, we talked about this in the presentation design series, but not this kind. I had a chance to go to a conference at App State, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago. They did a really great free learning conference. It was for ed tech professionals. And when I walked into the big presentation space for the opening morning plenary session, on every other seat, there was either a rock or a tennis ball, and I was intrigued. Okay. And the presenter at one point explained that the rock and the tennis ball represented different regions in the brain, and that we would have to do different things depending on whether or not we had a rock or a tennis ball. And so if we had a rock, the rock represented the limbic system. It's okay if you are not a neuroscience professional. Basically, the limbic system is the id. It's like, I want that, I'm gonna go get it, I'm hungry, I need to eat something, right? It makes a lot of like very evolutionarily driven decisions for you. If you have an urge to go do something, it's probably the limbic system. So if you had the limbic system, you had to get the rock, like the cave person brain right there, right? And you had to shake it like this and go, limbic system, okay? If you had the tennis ball, that was the prefrontal cortex. Again, you don't have to be a neuroscience expert. The prefrontal cortex is basically your friend who goes, is that a good idea though? And it filters everything from the limbic system. Go like, okay, I know you're hungry, but we're gonna have to wait. We're in the middle of a meeting, right? We'll have to wait for this, and then we can go plan and do something else. And the prefrontal cortex is kind of like that elegant evolved portion. So basically, we would take the tennis ball and we would kind of wave it in a figure eight and go, prefrontal cortex. Seriously, this all happened. So this was so novel and interesting, but he did a really great job of tying it into what he was talking about and how that impacts. Now, to give you some context for this talk before I hit play, excuse me, he's talking about how do we attract attention from students and how do we engage their attention, right? How do we help them pay attention to things that are important in class? And so this was a part of that. It's about 2 minutes, but again, I want you to encourage you to think about like just how novel something like this is in a presentation, but what a good job it does at engaging the audience.
We're going to do a little battle of the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. And the reason there's a battle, I mean, it shouldn't be thought of as a battle. It's kind of a symphony. But the fact is that in your students, and in all of us, we've got stuff going on that is below the surface. Or sometimes people call it system one thinking. That's what Daniel Kahneman talks about in Thinking Fast and Slow. It's this old brain thinking, intuitive primate thinking. That's limbic system. Oh, candy bar over there. I want it, you know? And then the prefrontal cortex is the part that goes, oh, you know, that would make Sally sad. That's her candy bar. Why don't you ask if you would share? Maybe you have something she wants, you know? So that's the battle that you're doing. And school is all about sort of bringing into the foreground the prefrontal cortex, training it to take some control over what is largely in all of our lives a subconscious or out-of-conscious experience of the world. We're getting so many, like right now, there's so many little things that are going on in terms of pheromones and micro-expressions on people's faces and how the air is feeling, and all the things like that. So let's do it, okay? So we're going to start out, you want to go take that candy bar, so we get the limbic system. Limbic system, limbic system, limbic system. Now, prefrontal cortex, limbic system, limbic system, limbic cortex. Now, prefrontal cortex, listen loud. Prefrontal cortex. Keep going. Prefrontal, limbic system. I really want it. Limbic system, limbic, prefrontal cortex. That's going on. Excellent. Now, that's going on in us all the time. And in fact, we don't acknowledge that and recognize that in our students and in ourselves. We're missing a big part of what is driving attention in the class. Because everybody, you say pay attention. I say, hey, pay attention, Kurt. You know, you're paying attention to something, right? Everybody is always paying attention to something. They may be paying attention to the fact that they're hungry, or that, you know, they have rent to pay, or that somebody just sent them a text. They're paying attention to something. So we've got to think, how does this work? And this is one of the primary ways that it works, this battle between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, or this symphony.
So you can see how, again, bit novel, definitely unexpected, but it ties in pretty well with what he's trying to talk about in terms of how that battle works when you're trying to help direct attention. That again, they are paying attention to something, but it might be something that supersedes that need, because the limbic system cares way more about the fact that it's hungry than the prefrontal cortex does about whatever's happening at the front of the room, right? And just understanding that battle. Do you notice how he stumbled at times and used filler words as well, but it didn't really matter, right? And part of that was down to the fact that he brought a lot of passion and energy to that, and that he was also willing to play with the audience, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. Challenging. So the C in the punch model is challenging. I was at an educational conference. It was the ASCD conference. They're more popular in K-12, but they do have some higher ed work that they do. And I went to one session, and it was being led by a social worker from Maryland. She started off with a story about when she was called to do a consult for one of the more rambunctious students in her school. He was about 7 years old, and he had come in on Monday, and even though he was very energetic, which was teacher code for he won't sit down, but this was a very energetic student who was very lethargic that day, and even worse, he had a black eye. And so the teacher called the social worker down, and social worker pulled the student out of class, and she had a conversation with him, and she said, you know, I couldn't help but notice that you're not feeling well today, and you have a mark on your face. Could you tell me what happened? And he said, well, I got into a fight with my uncle, and he hit me. And so the social worker called home and spoke with mom and said, you know, your son came into school today, he doesn't seem to have the same energy level, and not only that, he says that he was assaulted by his uncle. And mom burst out laughing. Because it turns out that the same year that this young man was born, grandma and grandpa had a surprise. And his uncle was also about the same age. They had had a sleepover, and while they were wrestling, he accidentally elbowed him in the face, right? This was a very unexpected thing to have happen, right? But that challenge of our expectations worked really well in that particular situation when she was talking about the importance of gathering information, making sure that we've considered all angles before making assumptions about what had happened. And so just having a challenging story like this that actually turned out to have a little bit of a humorous ending, that was a bit unexpected, right? These things all tied together, actually worked pretty well in this situation. I still think about that story. Okay? The H in the punch model, it's going to be humorous. And what I mean by this is incorporating a little bit of humor, like a joke or a funny story or something, toward the beginning of your presentation to get the audience engaged. Humor is a really powerful thing. It influences the brain's pleasure centers in really positive ways. It releases serotonin and dopamine, which is really effective. The brain loves that. It loves getting more of that. If you ever get me off topic, I can talk about how Facebook hires social researchers to manipulate all this. But I find that humor is a really great way to engage with the audience because it naturally releases these chemicals in the brain. And not only that, if you get a couple people laughing in a group, more people tend to laugh due to something called emotional contagion, which I could also talk ad nauseum about. What I mean by this is, again, if you're incorporating some kind of joke, I want to make a really quick side note here and say, like, if you don't think you're a funny person, stay in that lane. You know what I mean? And the reason that I say that, and it's not to be mean, it's just if you don't think you're a funny person, then you may not have a very effective line drawn in your mind of what is and is not appropriate for a joke within a session, right? On the flip side, there are some people who think they are very funny, and they are not, right? But usually you know when, like, it's basically the family member who makes a joke, and you're like, we're gonna have to unpack that later and have a conversation. But I do find humor to be pretty helpful in some situations. This time of year, I usually try and work in a joke about like grading and things like that, especially if I'm working with groups of faculty. So I show them a screenshot of this tweet. And it usually works well enough to break the ice, warm everybody up, release a little bit of serotonin and dopamine. People are just very happy when it comes in. So these are just some simple ways that you can start off with your audience in terms of beginning the presentation. Again, a lot of these things work really well together. You know, it could be a personal anecdote, it could be something completely unexpected that subverts some presentation norms. It could be something really novel or challenging their expectations, or it could be something humorous, right? Or any combination of those things all together. But these are really simple strategies for starting off a presentation and engaging with an audience that can be really helpful for you. So this is a nice little well to pull from. Those are some strategies for beginning the presentation. And again, I'm going to leave it to Francis to talk more about the actual public speaking piece. So I'm going to focus more on strategies so I'm not stepping on toes. The next thing would be, you know, we've prepared for our presentation, we've started off, now we need to engage the audience throughout. So let's talk about that engaging piece. And three things that I've found to be really effective for presenters who are very good at what they're doing, it would come down to these three things. They usually show some level of passion, proximity to the audience, and play. And what I mean by this is they're really passionate about their topic. They do things to limit the distance between them and the audience. And they're willing to play with the audience. And I'll show you examples of each of those. When it comes down to passion, we're looking for this from every presenter that we work with or pay attention to, right? We know when someone cares about their topic. It's something that audiences actively crave. That's why it's so hard to go to information-based sessions sometimes, especially when the presenter doesn't draw a line between why I should care about this and what it actually is. Right? Drawing that line is really important because we want that authenticity, we want that passion. Occasionally, I have some control over the projects that I work on and some of the things that I'm looking into, but there are also projects that I'm assigned that I don't care about as much. It just happens, and we all have projects like that. One thing a couple of years ago that I was asked to think about was, it was re-emerging as a trend. It was this whole BYOD, which is bring your own device, right? We know from e-card data that over 99% of our students bring some kind of digital internet-connected device with them to college, right? Usually a laptop and smartphone, and then the combinations from that branch out. And I was asked to do some research into here and then talk about it, and I'm gonna be honest, I didn't care about this at all. I was really struggling here, so I was like, I need some kind of angle because I personally needed to get through this, but I also needed to be able to talk about it from a position of authenticity when I talk to other people. So I dug a little bit deeper, and what I found is that we have this data called e-card data that gives us a lot of information about digital habits and things like that. And while the e-card data said that over 99% of our students come with an internet-connected device, what the e-card data doesn't say is how good is that device? What's the quality of that device? Because if they have a laptop and that's the only thing that's being measured, that's not an effective measurement to me as somebody who works in technology. Because if it's an 8-year-old laptop that was purchased from Walmart on Black Friday, right, and as a hand-me-down from family members who have been using it for several years, that's not a laptop that you can walk into the School of Comm with and run Photoshop. It's just not. So that student actually has a pretty significant technological barrier, but it's completely missed within the data because we're like, oh no, they have a laptop, right? Without actually looking at the qualities. So that became the angle that I cared about because I care about equity issues. So when BYOD became an equity issue for me, then I'm doing things like I'm talking to honesty scholars, and I've been a huge advocate, and I'm still going to do this. I feel bad doing this on camera, but I'm still a huge advocate for us requiring every student to have a laptop because then financial aid will be empowered and have the ability to devote financial aid specifically for technological devices. Because when we do have students with high financial needs, they are given pockets of funds for books and things like that, but if they live in California, as an example, some of those funds have to go toward moving them from California to North Carolina. That's a big sink in their money, right? So, and you can probably tell that I care about this because I've gotten way off topic. There's the passion, right? I had to find a reason for me to care about this so that when I talk to other people about it, they know that I care about it. Because you can't really fake passion. So I would encourage you to find out what is the angle that you ultimately care about. Usually when people, excuse me, can never clear my throat, years old. My experience personally has been that when people work in higher ed, and in particular when they work in student-facing groups that do a lot of work to onboard students into the college environment, there's usually a personal experience that you had that led you into that career field, or some area that you really care about, like you really enjoy working with students who, let's say, are making the transition from high school to college because you recognize how significant that is. So finding a way to tap into that and illustrate that with the audience is going to be really helpful because, again, they want to see that. They want to know that you are an authentic person. They want to know that you care about what you're doing. So it's finding the passion, then finding a way to express that when you talk to people. Proximity is another area. And what we're talking about is we're talking about closing the gap with the audience. Now, some professors who are really good about this in classroom situations, if you think about some of the better professors that you've had, they probably walked around the room, right? They would move around while they were speaking or while they were interacting with people. I think it's really weird in this room to do that. And not only that, now I'm off camera, even though they can hear me okay. So you can't always do proximity in terms of physical proximity. And not only that, I'm trying to be mindful of the fact that some of you may not want me in your personal space, and that's perfectly fine. right? Because as someone who is generally introvert in a good number of situations, I don't necessarily want to be in your personal space either, if that makes sense. No offense. But there are other things that you can do to reduce the distance with the audience. You can tell my hay fever's kicked in. And again, I'm wearing a microphone, so if I come out unclear in the next couple of moments, it should be okay on the recording because the audio will be better. But there are other things that you can do to reduce that distance with the audience, and it's just things that are as simple as making an effort to make eye contact with the room. You know how we talked about not putting a bunch of text up on the slides? Usually when people do that, they spend their time looking at this, right? And then they never actually look at the audience, which is problematic for a couple of different reasons. Like, A, if you have someone who is deaf or hard of hearing in the audience, the moment that you turn away, you have just cut the sound, basically, for them. They can't see you anymore. But not only that, you also have presentation situations where sometimes they'll only stare at one person in the group, which is really unfortunate. So if, as an example, you find yourself in a position of leadership, maybe you're teaching a course or something like that, and actually, let's run with that example. Let's say you're teaching a course. The students are giving presentations. They generally tend to look at the instructor. So I would encourage you in that case to sit somewhere else in the room to where they would have to look at a bunch of other people before they could get to you. But eye contact can be one. Open body language, right? Like if I'm up here like this isn't going to be very helpful for anyone. It makes it look like I'm defensive, even though I'm not. And not only that, but remembering to smile from time to time. And so I'm actually going to savage myself here. I was invited to be on a panel about maker education a couple years ago. This was like a local thing that the city of Burlington put on. And while I was introducing myself and talking about some of the great work we were doing with maker education at Elon, had open body language, I was making eye contact with everyone in the room, I remembered to smile, and then I sat down, and even though I was trying to be a good listener to Denise from Alamance Community College, who was sitting right next to me while she was speaking, I forgot that my resting face does not look like a happy face. It doesn't. I forgot to smile, and so I look like I really hate her in this photo, which I felt really bad about in hindsight because I don't know how many of you are connected with the maker movement in Burlington, but Ben, who runs Steam Junction downtown, he takes way too many photos at every single event, and he posts every single one of them. And so this is up there forever, where like, you know, I look happy and engaged and inviting, and then I look really, really mad that she's speaking in general. When in reality, I was just interested in what she had to say. I was trying to be a good listener and pay attention, right? So I wasn't being mindful of my body language there. It was kind of closed off because I was trying to indicate like I'm not talking right now. And I forgot to smile and things like that. So that proximity can be a way to engage with the audience. It's not always walking around the room. It's things that are as simple as remembering to smile from time to time, keeping your body language open, trying to make eye contact with everybody in the room, which that's usually like my go-to strategy for engaging with people. I try and do that pretty frequently. Play would be the last one, and that's just, this is kind of like that ambiguous fun element, right? It's just encouraging the audience to play with you in some way, shape, or form. And one of the best examples I could give for this, has anyone been to the Maker Hub, either location? A couple of people. Did they ever do, did you do a formalized visit where they did like the Marshmallow Challenge and a few other things with you? Okay. So I designed the original orientation activity for the space, and part of that involves an activity called the Marshmallow Challenge. And essentially what you do is you give the groups 18 minutes to build a structure out of spaghetti, tape, and string that can hold a marshmallow up on top. And the students and the faculty and staff who come into the space, they love this activity. It feels very frantic, it feels very fast-paced. There's a lot of laughter. There's a lot of good feeling that comes out of this. And my favorite is, like, even when the structures just completely fall over at the end, when we're closing up, they'll like hold their structure up, they'll take selfies with it, like it goes on Snapchat and everything. But it's just a simple way for them to experience something fun that's also constructive and a way to engage them in play. Now, when these three things come together in a presentation, it can be a really powerful experience. You could have any one of these on their own, but when you find a way to incorporate all three, and I would argue that proximity is really easy to do, especially once you turn it into habit, but showing your passion and being willing to play, it can be really powerful. So I want to show you a really quick clip of a presenter. He's not even using slides, but I think he's doing a really good job of showing his passion for the subject, reducing proximity to the audience, and engaging them directly in play.
Talking about expectations. But it doesn't matter, you know, it's just, you know, the pentatonic scale for some reason.
Okay, so just do that in your next presentation. And I will say, I recognize sometimes I use really extreme examples, but it's because they do such a good job of illustrating what we're talking about. I don't expect you to sing in your next presentation if you don't want to. But B, this was so good at demonstrating passion, proximity, and play that some of you actually clapped, right? I know I heard at least 2 or 3 people who clapped for the clip. And those are the 3 things that can come together and really make the difference in a presentation as you're trying to engage an audience throughout, that are really nice complements to the things that we've already talked about in terms of storytelling techniques and delivering content to an audience. As a little bonus for this section, since I just mentioned storytelling techniques, there are some storytelling techniques that help engage the audience as well that we didn't talk about in presentation design, but that would work well in an engagement situation. So one of those would be identifying a problem that the audience may not be aware of, or identifying why that problem exists. Right? We love to solve mysteries. So, hey, there's a problem and, oh, wait, here's why that problem happens. Or how you solved that problem and demonstrating that and why you solved that problem. Right? Why was that a problem that you needed to do? And most importantly, a story that evokes some kind of an emotion with an audience. I'm going to play a quick clip of Barry Schwartz. This is a TED Talk called Our Loss of Wisdom. And essentially what the core message of this is that when things go wrong, we usually turn to a combination of rules and penalties to try and figure out how do we resolve this issue. What he's arguing is that the practical wisdom may not be to follow rules, but to actually break them because it would be morally wise to do so. And what I want you to notice is how he's going to use this story to contextualize his message, but also that, and more importantly, to emotionally engage his audience.
This is the job description of a hospital janitor that is scrolling up on the screen. And all of the items on it are unremarkable. They're the things you would expect. Mop the floors, sweep them, empty the trash, restock the cabinets. It may be a little surprising how many things there are, but it's not surprising what they are. But the one thing I want you to notice about them is this. Even though this is a very long list, there isn't a single thing on it that involves other human beings. Not one. The janitor's job could just as well be done in a mortuary as in a hospital. And yet, when some psychologists interviewed hospital janitors to get a sense of what they thought their jobs were like, they encountered Mike, who told them about how he stopped mopping the floor because Mr. Jones was out of his bed getting a little exercise, trying to build up his strength, walking slowly up and down the hall. And Charlene told them about how she ignored her supervisor's admonition and didn't vacuum the visitors' lounge because there were some family members who were there all day, every day, who at this moment happened to be taking a nap. And then there was Luke, who washed the floor in a comatose young man's room twice, because the man's father, who had been keeping a vigil for 6 months, didn't see Luke do it the first time, and his father was angry. And behavior like this from janitors, from technicians, from nurses, and if we're lucky every now and then from doctors, doesn't just make people feel a little better, it actually improves the quality of patient care and enables hospitals to run well. Now, not all janitors are like this, of course, but the ones who are think that these sorts of human interactions involving kindness, care, and empathy are an essential part of the job, and yet their job description contains not one word about other human beings. These janitors have the moral will to do right by other people, and beyond this, they have the moral skill to figure out what doing right means.
So you can see where that story pulled in a lot of his messaging. This is actually how he started off the presentation. This is very early in there. The goal with these strategies is usually to evoke some kind of an emotion. And usually when most people watch that clip, they seem to get a little bit of a feeling here, especially with the story of the janitor who mopped the patient's room twice, right? And you felt something with it. Like you probably felt something in that clip. it was an important story for them to tell. Excuse me. That's what we're looking for here, is some way to engage the audience on an emotional level. A lot of times we overlook this, right? Again, it comes down to getting them to care about something, but not only that, but you finding a way to express that you care about it too. One last example I'll give is UNC Greensboro. They did a session at a conference that I went to on open educational resources. So these are resources that are free to openly use, modify, and redistribute. And part of the reason that they did this, and they actually started off with videos about why an instructor might want to do this, they interviewed some of the students on their campus, and they said, what is it like balancing the cost of textbooks with some of your other expenses? And there were students in there talking about, the one that stood out most to me, there was a male student who was talking about how he had to skip a meal plan one semester because he needed books, and the professor was very strict the first day and said, like, no, you are going to need all of these textbooks. And so he had to forego the meal plan because he couldn't afford the full thing. That was a decision that he had to make. And that was a really powerful part of those videos that they had put together, because it was like, we have students who are choosing literally between eating and buying books, and we may want to look for a more open alternative that doesn't incur that level of cost and force them to choose between those two things. So those are the ideas behind engaging. Usually it comes down to just, again, showing your passion and engaging the audience in some way on an emotional level. All right, let's say you've done all this, you're ready to close out. You need to end strong, right? This brings us to our endings. What are some good strategies for ending our presentation? Well, first is one model that we already talked about. I think the punch model works very well for beginning a presentation, but I think it also works very well for ending presentations. So I want to encourage you to rethink how that might help you end a situation. This could also play into the humor piece. I don't know how many of you routinely watch stand-up or watch stand-up from time to time, but you know those routines that you really enjoy where they make a joke like a third of the way in and then they close with that joke too, right? So just a little callback there. And that's one strategy that you can also use. You can loop back to the beginning. If you end up watching that Barry Schwartz talk that I used a clip of just a minute ago, he actually loops back to the beginning when he closes out his speech. It creates a nice little packaged feeling. You could summarize your main points, which is really helpful, especially if this is more of an instructive type session. So the audience has just a quick landmark or a roadmap type of idea of what was just covered and what they should prioritize in terms of being things that they had hopefully learned. You could tell a story. There was a really great TED Talk that is pretty popular. It's Ken Robinson talking about, I hate the title, he's like, Why Schools Kill Creativity. But he talked about a young woman who, she moved around a lot while she was a young girl. And by that I mean like literally moved around a lot. Like it wasn't they were moving place to place. It was just when she was in class she had a hard time sitting still. She loved to move around. And they ended up taking her to a doctor to diagnose what might be wrong with her. And the doctor put on the radio and then stepped down to the hallway with the mom, and they waited a couple of minutes, and she just started getting up and dancing and moving around the room. And the doctor said, there's nothing wrong with your daughter. She's a dancer. Take her to a dance school, right? She went on to become the choreographer for Cats, right? So it was a really great story to end on that was like, you know, creativity exists in a lot of different realms. Skills exist in a lot of different realms, and we can respect and nurture those. You could tell a joke, right? One of the presentations that I do about my argument for why we need makerspaces and why maker education is so valuable, one key factor of that is that failure is a really valuable skill to learn. Not only that, but more so failure resiliency, right? You need to be good at not being good at things, because that's a natural part of learning anything, and as you get better and better, if you don't overcome that struggle, if you don't overcome when things are hard, then you're not going to get very far. So one of the things that I talk about is how we as educational professionals need to build in room in learning environments for failure to happen. And I use this image to reinforce that idea. Right? So we're just building failure into our learning environments. I love this, by the way. This always makes me happy for some reason. You could end with a quotation of some kind, right, that really helps drive things home. One of the sessions I used to do, and again, I'm going to pull on a lot of personal examples here because I want to show you that I like walk the talk here. But when I talk about the value of educational technology and why people might want to use it and how they could use it intentionally, I pull on a quote from a professor who She made some headlines back in maybe 2010 or so, because she was one of the first instructors to take Twitter and actively use it as part of her coursework, where the students were expected to sign up for accounts and tweet during class using a special hashtag, so that that was one way that they could participate and ask questions and offer responses. And she was talking about how it really boosted engagement in her class. Instead of 3 or 4 students, she had 30 or 40 that were regularly interacting with her in a meaningful way. And one of the last questions that an interviewer had asked her was, what would you say to someone who's like, this is interesting, but it's really messy? And she said, yes, it's going to be messy, but messy doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be bad. This was the original slide. It was this small, believe it or not. This is how long I've been using this quote. And I just ended with this quote and telling everyone in my audience I hope they ended up with really messy classrooms, right? Where they could experiment a bit and tying it in. And I'm sure that there are plenty of quotes that mean something to you. This might be another good strategy to run with that would wrap things up nicely and give the audience something good to go out on. Also, a call to action is another good way to go, especially if you need them to do something and that something is very important. Now, I'm going to give you some quick context for this next clip because it includes a call to action. So this is Dr. Amy Cuddy. Part of her research revolved around the idea that if you took on like power poses before really stressful situations, that would improve your confidence in that situation. That might also do things like raise certain hormone levels. The research related to the hormone levels has basically been questioned, and so that is in dispute right now. However, the self-reported feelings of confidence does seem to be pretty solid here, so I want you to know that, like, A, don't pay too much attention to the science in this clip. It's more so, what is she doing? Okay, so I hate to say pay less attention to what she's saying, but it's more so how she's saying it and how is she driving the audience to have a call to action here. What is she asking them to do and why?
The last thing I want to leave you with is this. Tiny tweaks can lead to big changes. So this is 2 minutes. 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. Before you go into the next stressful evaluative situation, for 2 minutes, try doing this in the elevator, in a bathroom stall, at your desk behind closed doors. That's what you want to do. Configure your brain to cope the best in that situation. Get your testosterone up, get your cortisol down. Don't leave that situation feeling like, oh, I didn't show them who I am. Leave that situation feeling like, oh, I really feel like I got to say who I am and show who I am. So I want to ask you first, both to try power posing, and also I want to ask you to share this science, because this is simple. I don't have ego involved in this. Give it away, share it with people, because the people who can use it the most are the ones with no resources and no technology and no status and no power. Give it to them, because they can do it in private. They need their bodies, privacy, and 2 minutes, and it can significantly change the outcomes of their life. Thank you.
And so clearly it went well, right? But just that call to action can be really powerful, especially if you need them to start incorporating something. You notice how she's basically making an appeal to emotion and also basically a moral appeal here to help others, right? And those are just some of the strategies you can use for ending a presentation. So again, I consider these to be the 4 major stages of a presentation. You have the preparation phase, which is, again, where you're going to spend most of your time. But if you want to reduce that anxiety, if you want to feel more prepared, it typically comes down to, how do I reframe my stress? How do I cut back on the filler language if it's a problem, right? And how do I make sure that I'm focusing on what my audience's why is, because that's ultimately what they're going to take away from it. If you want them to attach something from your presentation to their personal life, they need to know why they should be caring about it. Those beginning stages, again, we talked about that punch model, the personal, unexpected, novel, challenging, humorous. Engaging the audience throughout with passion, proximity, and play, and then ending with some of those other strategies. Like you could revert to the punch model again, but also things like just summarizing, having some kind of story in there, having a quotation, something that works to really package things up nicely. What I want to do now is I just wanted to check in and see if you had any questions. We've been through 3 different sessions now on presentation design, graphic design, and then presentation delivery strategies. And again, I will leave it to Frances to talk about some of the public speaking techniques, because again, I don't want to step on toes, and she's a fantastic instructor. Can't say enough nice things about her. So are there any questions that I can be helpful with about anything in those 3 sessions up until now? Yes, no, maybe? Yeah.
So the other day in one of my classes, I had to present a budget proposal,
Mhm.
and in that, we just put up a slideshow of all of our numbers,
Mhm.
right? And that's really hard to read, but we also didn't want to assume that the people in the room had read what we were presenting.
Mhm.
So how do you present a lot of numbers in a way that's easy without showing all of them? You know what I'm saying?
Yes. So again, if you missed the question, it was basically if you have a lot of numbers in the presentation or a lot of data, how do you simplify that for the audience so that they get some meaning and value out of that? Usually what I would do in that situation, especially when there is a lot of data or a lot of numbers, I would put it all on some kind of handout to provide to the audience. And then again, the purpose of the handout is full context. The purpose of the presentation is what does it actually mean, right? What are the highlights? So I would pick out probably the 3 or 4 most important things out of that budget and then highlight those within the presentation so that you can draw attention to that spot on the handout as you go through it. Because you're right, if you put all the numbers up on the screen, not only is it going to be hard to read, but it's going to be really overwhelming for the audience, and it's going to be really difficult as a result for them to prioritize what's actually important in there. So again, that's my basic suggestion. Have the handout and then focus on what are the 3 big things. Like maybe you're asking for something new this year. That's important, right? I would talk about that and make the case for why and what's in there. Even things like maybe there are changes to how that budget is being allocated. You know, we had one year where all of our conference expenses went from being under 1 budget line to being under like 8 or 9. And so that was an important thing. But that's my general advice. Put all the data on a handout so that they can read it, but call attention to, let's say, the 3 or 4 most important things or the 3 or 4 things that have changed the most within the presentation. Yeah, it'll help them focus, yeah. Yes?
Any strategies for sort of staying grounded as you're delivering your presentation? I'm thinking about like looking at your audience and maybe there's a lot of fidgeting or like you said, people are on like different technology. Like, when I've given presentations and that's happened, I've become distracted by that. So any strategies for kind of staying focused?
Yep. So the question was essentially like if you notice the audience might be a little off task or their attention is wavering, what can you do? Is that essentially is that a fair way to put it? Like how do you?
Not have it take you off course. Like I get distracted by something, not being distracted.
Gotcha. So in terms of you personally not getting distracted by it as the presenter, it can be really challenging. I remember when we redesigned Alamance 207, a lot of new furniture. That was the first classroom that we did a really big revamp of as part of the Learning Spaces work group. And the chairs in there, they swivel. And the feedback that we got from the faculty was they hate that, but the students love it because like they have a little bit of extra energy in class and it just happens to go into this motion. It's just very distracting for the instructors. And so in some situations, it might be one of those things where you have to find a way to just move past it. That's not always going to be the case, right? Like I can't tell an entire group of students to please don't swivel in your chairs, right? They're going to do it anyway because they don't even think about it. On the flip side of that, if you are worried that people are starting to disengage a little bit, one strategy that I try and use is incorporate a change up every 5 minutes or so into the presentation. It could be something as simple as a quick joke or a video clip or a quote or changing topics entirely, but regularly changing gears about the time that attention starts to wane a little bit naturally is another quick way to re-engage the audience. If you've been going for a while, I would encourage you to even incorporate stretch breaks into there, where maybe every 45 minutes or so you have them stand up, stretch, shake off the rust a little bit. That can help people feel revitalized, and sometimes they just want to shake off some of that energy, especially because I know sometimes we bring people in and it just becomes a gauntlet of activity all day long. Like I always feel so bad for anyone interviewing in our department because it's a day-long affair where they meet with like 18 different people, and it starts at 8:30 and it ends at 4, and I'm like, man, I was exhausted. I feel like I slept an entire day after I interviewed Elon. And that was several years ago, and so we still do that. But those are just some of the things I would consider. Like some of that you can't get past, and I recognize occasionally, especially the more senior the staff I'm working with, the more I'm like, I know that they're going to be checking their phone and that not only that, their phone's not going to be on silent, and I'm not going to be able to tell them to put their phone on silent, and it's going to bling, and they're going to need to text someone back because that is the nature of their work. And so with some of that, I have to deal with it, and I'm not a huge fan, but it happens, I guess. In other situations, it's more just finding a way to change things up every couple of minutes or so that the audience can re-engage with you. And they will naturally drift. Like you all naturally drifted probably several times today because that's just the nature of attention. It happens.
Can I add something
Yeah.
to that in terms of how it's not rattle you? I like to look for the one person who is paying attention and actively shaking their head and is engaging, and that's the person I tend to focus on. And that this might shift throughout the presentation depending on how long it goes. And I find that to be really helpful. And if I am in a conference space and I know people, and I ask somebody to come to be that person, so I know I have at least one, he will be my champion throughout the presentation.
I like that. Right. Anything else I can be helpful with? It doesn't just have to be this session. It can be any of the 3 sessions. If it would be helpful, I can put together a list of the videos that I used in this session that I have in case you wanted to watch those. Again, I want to reiterate that idea that if you want to be a really good presenter, you have to watch a lot of other people present, because even bad presentations can be very informative, right? Very illustrative of things to avoid. Because how many of you were the I want to present first person in class? Any of you like that? Okay. And I still run into students like that who if there are group presentations or individual presentations, they want to go first. I always wanted to go last. And the reason I always wanted to go last was I nervous through part of that? Sure, waiting can be a little bit nerve-wracking. But it also gave me a chance to see oh, they really struggle with the projector, or the sound doesn't work in this room, I need to bring a speaker, or hey, they did this thing that the instructor really didn't like, and now I can avoid doing that thing. So even when presentations are bad, you can learn a lot from them in terms of just the things that went wrong and how you might avoid those situations. But there are also some really cool techniques that you can pull from other people and styles. And I always say basically new ideas are inspiration, like other people's ideas, plus iteration, where you just evolve it a little bit. Honestly, if you ever hire a graphic designer, that's exactly what they do. Anytime you ask them to do something, they find someone else's designs that they really like, they incorporate elements, and they iterate on them to make something new. So don't be afraid to steal ideas and make them your own as you go on. I always say that R&D in higher ed stands for rip off and duplicate. Think about how we do some of our programming. I have no shame about stealing a good idea. I really don't. Yeah.
I think to the end of stealing other people's ideas, where do you get your graphic images? So your photos, the stock photo websites are really helpful.
Yep.
The graphic images.
So the graphic images almost always come from nounproject.com, which is, let me see if I can.
Michael, can you say the name of that again? I just couldn't hear it.
Yes. Let me. Yeah, if it's iconography, it probably came from nounproject.com. The goal of this website is to create a visual representation of pretty much every noun. What I like about it is even if you don't have a membership here, you can download all the icons for free. You just have to give attribution for them. And if you do get a subscription, which I think is $20 for an educational license, it's pretty affordable, and then you don't have to worry about the attribution. We have an internal license, and the Maker Hub has a license too, because sometimes people incorporate these into laser etching projects. But if there was something it's this huge searchable database, and all these are available to use for free. I feel like I didn't pick a very cool search term, but now it's just a bunch of buildings. But if it was something like technology. And thankfully, sometimes people put in different collections and sets and things like this. And again, these are all free to use. There's even a nice little feature where you can typically download them in a specific color. So you can change that ahead of time. I want to download it like that. And they're easy to drag and drop right into a presentation. So Yeah, when I do have the icons and the graphics, 9 times out of 10 they came directly from here. Sometimes they're built into the app and I self-constructed, but yeah, like I used to do this in the graphic design session, but it's really easy to make the target logo in PowerPoint because it's basically just 3 circles over top of one another, and if you make one circle the same color as the background, bleeds right through it, looks like it's not there. But yeah, that's usually where my graphics come from. It's usually from here, or I try and self-construct using the shapes tool and the whole group together and combine features. Okay. Anyone else? Feeling pretty good? All right, well, let me go ahead and put this back up so you can see my email address. I've worked with several people across campus as they were preparing for presentations, sometimes for conferences, sometimes actually for the board. So I'm happy to meet with you and give you a second set of eyes. I'll tell you the same thing I tell the students, which is if you give me 2 weeks, I can help you more than if you give me 2 days. You know what I mean? So the more lead time that you have, and 2 months, that's plenty of time to work on something. Because usually I encourage people to think about how are you going to design the content first, and then how are we going to make that visual. But we can talk about some strategies from there. So please do feel free to rely on me as a resource. And I really appreciate you spending so much time with me over the past 3 months. I know it's just been these 3 sessions, but I appreciate your willingness to show up and learn and take some of these strategies and apply them in. So if you run into any trouble with those strategies, or again, you just want a second set of eyes or someone to bounce ideas off of, just let me know. Happy to meet up, or we can even grab coffee or something like that and work from there. Sound fair? All right, well, we are out 10 minutes early, so I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Please grab coffee and tea and fruit and things like that, and I will see you around campus.
Thank you.
Thanks.